Hi, and welcome to LV Scary Stories. My name is Leng, and I was born in Southeast Asia before moving to the United States at the age of 6. In this video, I'll be sharing 4 chilling ghost stories from my community, stories that have been passed down through generations. While some details may have faded over time, their essence remains intact. A warning before we begin. Some parts of these stories contain graphic and sensitive content, including themes of suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you for watching and enjoy the stories. Story number 1. When I was a young man living in Laos with my family, I had 2 sisters. The oldest was Ping, and the second oldest was Dee. Even though our family was mostly boys, my 2 sisters never got along. They would always argue and rarely helped each other with household chores. Whenever they fought, my parents would almost always side with Ping. I remember one evening when my mother asked Ping to do a chore. Ping was busy with something else and purposely took her time. After waiting for a while, my mother told Dee to do it instead. Dee had already spent the entire day working at the farm with my parents, so she was upset that she had to do the chore. As usual, this led to an argument between the sisters, and once again, my parents sided with Ping. In a traditional household, younger siblings are expected to respect and not argue with their elders, which is why my parents always took Ping's side. Dee wasn't just angry, she was deeply hurt. I still remember her words as she cried and said to my parents, "Why do you always take Ping's side? Am I not your daughter too? Whether she's right or wrong, you always defend her. The day you finally scold Ping will be the day I die." After saying this, she ran into her bedroom. The next morning, we assumed Dee had gone to the farm early since she wasn't home. But when we arrived at the farm, she wasn't there. The entire day passed, and she was nowhere to be found. My parents grew increasingly worried as night fell, and still, there was no sign of her. They started asking around the village, but no one had seen her all day. The next morning, Dee was found near our farm. She had hanged herself from a tree. What was strange was that there were 2 ropes. One was used to hang herself, while the other lay beneath her feet. My father and the village men cut her down and brought her body back for a traditional funeral. During the funeral, my father sent one of his brothers to speak with Dee's boyfriend and his family to find out what had happened that night. According to her boyfriend, when he visited Dee the night before she vanished, she was acting strangely and kept talking about death. She repeatedly asked if he wanted to commit suicide with her. He was shocked and told her they had only just begun their relationship. There was no reason to talk about such things. But Dee wouldn't stop. She spoke about dying together, and then, suddenly, her voice deepened. That frightened him, so he left. My uncle then brought up the second rope found at the scene of her death. He asked the boyfriend about it. The boyfriend admitted that Dee had told him she would bring a rope for him too. She had planned for them to die together, but when he didn't show up at their agreed-upon meeting place, she took her own life alone. After Dee's burial, strange things started happening in the village. At night, some villagers reported seeing a rope with a noose being squeezed through the woven bamboo walls of their homes from the outside. It would hang there for a minute or two before slowly being pulled back out. One night, a married couple got into an argument. In anger, the wife shouted that she wanted to hang herself. Later that night, after they had made up and were in a better mood, the wife was sweeping the floor when she saw a noose being slipped into their home through the bamboo wall. She froze and stared at it. Then, she began spitting on the floor and scolding the presence outside, telling it to leave her and her family alone. Moments later, the noose was slowly pulled back out. Everyone in the village believed it was Dee's ghost returning to haunt them. Some elders thought she was still waiting for her boyfriend so they could die together. Since he never came, she continued offering the second rope to see if anyone would join her. They believed the only way for Dee's ghost to move on was for someone to take their life with her extra rope. Many people might think this is just a tale, but this is a true event from my family's past. Thank you for listening. Story number 2. A long time ago, when we were still living in Southeast Asia, my father was a young man, and I was about 10 years old when this event happened. Our farm was far from the village. It took about a 3-hour walk to get there. Beyond our farm, if you went over the mountain to the other side, there was a stream that formed 3 small ponds. I remember one time when I went with my father to those ponds. There were frogs everywhere. Their croaking filled the air. We hadn't planned on catching frogs for dinner, so we didn't bring anything to prepare. Still, we managed to catch 8 frogs and took them back to the farm to cook. The walk back was long and tiring. That night, my parents, my sister, and I slept at our farmhouse. The next day, before sunset, my father told my mother and sister to return to the village to feed the pigs and chickens. He said he would take me to the ponds to catch more frogs, and we would return home the following day. After my mother and sister left our farm to go back to the village, my father strapped a bamboo bucket to his back, and we set off toward the other side of the mountain. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting. We each grabbed a stick and started catching frogs, striking at them as they jumped in all directions. After filling about half the bucket, my father suddenly told me to stop. He stood still, listening intently. It was eerily quiet. The frogs had stopped croaking, and we noticed that they were staying low underwater, as if hiding. "Don't move," my father whispered. We were both knee-deep in the pond when he took 3 cautious steps forward. As soon as he did, we heard the sound of 3 footsteps nearby, but we couldn't see anyone. We were alone. To test it, my father slapped the water twice. A moment later, we heard the same slapping sound, 2 distinct splashes, yet no one else was there. That was when my father said, "We need to leave. We have enough frogs." We climbed out of the pond, and by then the sun had already set. As we started walking back, we heard footsteps following us, keeping pace. At that moment, I could sense that my father was scared. He spotted a dry bamboo stick on the ground, picked it up, and called out, "Who's there? Why are you so bold?" Immediately, we heard a voice mimicking him from the darkness. "Who's there? Why are you so bold?" My father remembered what the elders had said. If you ever encounter a spirit that mimics your movements, you should walk backward. So, we started walking backward. The sound of footsteps continued, and it felt as if the presence was getting closer. We kept moving backward, heading toward the direction of the sunset, because that was where our farm was. After a while, my father realized that this wasn't working. The elders also said that if walking backward didn't help, the next thing to do was to walk sideways. He whispered, "Walk sideways." We turned and moved sideways, leading with our left legs first. As soon as we did, we heard the sound of footsteps, but this time it was going in the opposite direction. We were heading toward the sunset, and whatever was following us was going toward the sunrise. Shortly after that, the footsteps stopped. The eerie presence was gone. We made it back to the farm safely and spent the night there. The next morning, we returned home to our village. At noon that day, as we ate frog legs for lunch, my father told my mother about our encounter. "I didn't see it," I admitted, "but I know something was there." My father, however, did see it. When we were about to walk sideways, he said, I glanced toward some trees not too far from us, and I saw it. He described it as a man wearing traditional clothes, but there was a rope tied around his body at elbow height. His head was covered by a brown bag, the kind people used to carry opium, and that thing had been mimicking our every move. A long time ago, there was an uncle in our village who frequently traveled to a nearby village to do business. He had many friends and often carried opium in those brown bags. One day, he left for his usual trip, but he never came back. His family searched for him for a long time, but he was never found. My father believed that the spirit we encountered at the ponds was him. Story number 3. Back in Laos, I was a village chief, and oftentimes I had to deal with the problems of my villagers. One day, 2 brothers got into an argument that escalated into a fight. The younger brother, Kong, refused to listen to his older brother and even fought him and their father. In a fit of rage, Kong struck his father on the head with a stick, causing him to bleed. When I arrived, Kong was still attacking his father and brother with the stick. I grabbed his right wrist and firmly told him to let go. "Aren't you afraid of karma for striking your elders?" I asked him. As I held his wrist, I noticed he was wearing a red copper bracelet. Kong let go of the stick, sobbing, and then ran off. That day, Kong was furious because his father wouldn't allow him to marry his girlfriend. According to tradition, the eldest son was supposed to marry first. However, his older brother had been single for a long time. He was considered unattractive and had no prospects for marriage. No one knew how long Kong would have to wait if his father insisted on following tradition. I turned to Kong's father and said, "Your sons are getting older. Many of their peers are already married with children. If Kong has to wait until his older brother gets married first, he might be waiting for a long time. Since your eldest son has no prospects, I think it would be reasonable to let Kong marry his girlfriend first." After hearing my words, Kong's father seemed to agree. However, after Kong ran away that day, he was never seen again. His family and the villagers searched for him for many days, but he was nowhere to be found. A year passed, and when he still hadn't returned, his family feared the worst, that he might have died. So, they performed a soul-releasing ritual to allow his spirit to move on and be reincarnated. As the years went by, the villagers gradually forgot about Kong. He had been gone for too long, and some believed he might have been eaten by a tiger, which was why his remains were never found. Years later, one day, my son Pal and I went hunting 2 mountains away from our village. Since we were far from home, we planned to camp overnight before returning the next day. That day, we managed to catch a few birds and a wild hog. As the sun began to set, Pal and I found a spot to camp. We built a small shelter from sticks and banana leaves, gutted the animals, and started a fire to dry the meat for preservation. When night fell, Pal and I sat by the fire, eating our meal. Suddenly we heard footsteps circling us. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal. It sounded human. I stood up and called out, "Who's there? Are you hungry? If you are, we have food to share." For a moment there was silence. Then, from the darkness, I heard sobbing. A voice spoke, "Uncle, do you know if my parents still live in the village?" The voice was faint, yet strangely familiar. I almost didn't recognize it. Then it spoke again. "Do you know if my girlfriend is married?" That's when I realized it was Kong. I answered, "Your parents still live in the village, but they believed you were dead, so they already performed a soul-releasing ritual for you. As for your girlfriend, she got married and has 2 children now." The voice sobbed again before saying, "I live under a tree toward the sunrise. If you 2 are not in a hurry tomorrow, please visit me before you return home." I assured him that we would visit in the morning. After that, we heard footsteps fading into the distance. My son Pal was just as shocked as I was. He and Kong had grown up together in our village. The next morning, before packing up to leave, Pal and I walked toward the sunrise as Kong had instructed. Not far from our campsite, we came upon a large willow tree. Beneath the tree lay scattered bones. Kneeling down, we examined them closely, and I saw a red copper bracelet among them. At that moment, I knew these were Kong's remains. He must have come here and taken his own life, perhaps by ingesting poison. Before leaving, Pal and I built a fire beneath the tree. We burned his bones and prayed for his spirit to move on, to be reincarnated and no longer remain in that place. Afterward, Pal and I returned to the village. I reported our discovery to Kong's father. When he heard the news, he was devastated. His son had indeed passed away. Story number 4. Back then, there was a small village called Lee Village. Due to its small size, they didn't have enough Kang players when one of their elders became sick and passed away. Kang players are an essential part of a funeral, as their music helps guide the soul of the deceased to the afterlife. I was a Kang player, bringing honor to my family. At the time, I was a young, single man. Because of my popularity in playing the traditional Kang, my family arranged my marriage to the village chief's daughter. Bringing honor to my family included marrying someone who could elevate my status and secure my future. Yet, my heart often wondered what it would be like to leave my village in search of love, someone I could truly connect with. However, as my parents' only son, I was bound to obey their wishes and marry whomever they chose for me. Since I was a well-known Kang player, many families and villages sought my help whenever a funeral was held. One day, someone from Lee Village came to request my assistance because one of their elders had just passed away. The funeral had already started, but they didn't have enough Kang players for the rotation. I accepted their request, packed my things, and set off for Lee Village. When I arrived, I began playing a Kang song for the deceased. The villagers were captivated by the way I played, and the young women whispered among themselves, asking for my name. The most beautiful girl in the village was Leah. She had fallen for me. During and after the funeral, I spent some time in the village, building a friendship with her. That's when I learned that Leah, too, was in an arranged marriage. Once she came of age, her future husband would come to claim her. Despite our feelings for each other, we knew we could never break the arranged marriages our parents had set for us. It wasn't surprising. Every beautiful girl was spoken for before she was even old enough to understand love. But during my time in Lee Village, Leah and I shared a special moment, experiencing what it was like to truly connect with someone rather than being forced into a union. Before leaving, I promised her that when I had time, I would return to see her. As a parting gift, Leah packed sticky rice with chicken wrapped in banana leaves for me. As I walked away, I knew in my heart it was probably the last time I would see her. Breaking an arranged marriage was a disgrace, bringing shame upon both families. I didn't want that for myself or Leah. I knew that by the time I returned, she would likely already be married. After the funeral, I became occupied with life. Other villages sought my services as a Kang player for funerals and cultural ceremonies. I was busy, and eventually, I forgot about Leah. I never returned to her village. Years passed, and I was married to the village chief's daughter. We had several children, and I was already a middle-aged man when this event happened. One day, 2 young men from another village arrived, searching for me. They had heard of my reputation as a skilled Kang player for funerals. They came to my house bringing alcohol as an offering and bowed before me, requesting my service. Their grandfather had just passed away, and since he was a great leader of their clan, they wanted the best funeral service for him. These 2 young men were from Bang Village. I accepted their offering and agreed to help with the funeral. I told them I had a few matters to tend to, but would arrive in the evening. I instructed them to return to their village ahead of me. That evening, I informed my wife that I would be gone for a few days. I asked her to take care of our children and farm animals while I was away. Then I packed my belongings and set off for Vang village. By the time I arrived, night had already fallen. I rested for a short while inside the house where the funeral was being held. After some time, I began playing the kang for the deceased. Our funerals last 24 hours a day and can extend from 3 to 7 days. Generally, the older the deceased, the longer the funeral lasts. Younger individuals tend to have shorter ceremonies. As I was playing in the middle of the night, a strong gust of wind suddenly blew the doors open. A rush of air swept through the house, sending objects flying. Everyone froze, waiting in silence until the wind died down. The village elders whispered among themselves. Such an event was not a good sign. It was believed that the deceased might be unhappy with the funeral service. Feeling uneasy, I requested to be switched out, and another kang player took my place while I stepped outside for a break. I sat on a bench against the wall, joined by an older man from the village who offered me a cigarette. As we sat there, he shared a similar story from years ago. A young woman in our village died during childbirth, he said. On the third night of her funeral, the wind blew the doors open just like tonight, but we managed to complete the ceremony. As we spoke, a young man stepped outside, calling the uncle inside to fulfill his part of the funeral service. I told him I would remain outside until I was needed. I leaned against the wall, smoking the cigarette the uncle had left behind. The night was calm, but the sudden gust of wind earlier had been unsettling. As I gazed at the stars, I found myself reminiscing about Leah. I wondered if she had been happy in her marriage. Thoughts swirled in my mind. Despite having a wife and children, there was still an emptiness inside me I couldn't explain. Suddenly, I heard a whisper in the wind. Someone was calling my name. I turned toward the darkness beneath the large willow tree. There, a shadowy figure stood, calling to me in a familiar voice. Slowly I approached. As I neared the tree, the moonlight revealed the figure. It was Leah. I was now a middle-aged man, yet Leah appeared unchanged, as if time had never touched her. She looked just as she had when I first met her. I reached out, but before my hands could touch hers, I asked if she had married. She nodded. I withdrew my hand. It would be shameful to touch another man's wife. Leah began to sob. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Fate never allowed us to be together, but I have a request." I hesitated before asking what it was. Leah looked at me with sorrowful eyes. "Many years ago, I had complications during my third childbirth. I left behind my husband and 2 children. During my funeral, I waited for you to come and play the kang to send me off, but you never came. Before you leave this village, will you play the kang for me?" At that moment, the cigarette burned my fingers, jolting me awake. It was just a dream. I was still on the bench, leaning against the wall. Looking toward the willow tree, there was no one there. Later I learned that I hadn't been dreaming. Leah had indeed married into Vang village. One of the 2 young men who had come to request my help was her son. Leah had died in this village during childbirth. Once the funeral ended and the deceased was buried, I packed my belongings, preparing to leave. As I reached the edge of the village, I looked back at Vang village one last time. When no one was around, I lifted my kang and played a funeral song. One final farewell to send Leah's spirit off to be reincarnated. Then I returned home to my wife and children. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.